Okay, good afternoon or good evening, or maybe possibly good morning to some of you. My name is Tim Doyle. I'm the CEO of the Drupal Association. And this is a call about a proposal that the Drupal Association Board of Directors began working on back at their board retreat right before DrupalCon Atlanta this past March. And it has to do with back then, the board was investigating an opportunity to create a presence in Europe to gain better access to European philanthropic funding sources that support open source. And then over the course of conversations with the European community, but also just in reflecting about some of the needs of the project, the idea expanded or kind of transformed into an investigation of really changing how the Drupal Association is organized to support the Drupal project and the Drupal community, and to really rethink how we could do it in a better, more international, more global manner that brought stakeholders formally into the governance of the Drupal Association. So that's the purpose of this call. What I'm going to do over the next, not too long, the next hour or so, is to go over the idea and the why of why we're pursuing this or thinking about it, some of the details of what is being talked about and proposed. And the goal is that the ask at the end will be that for those associations that want to participate in the investigation of this process, we would ask you to identify someone to represent your association on a board-created working group called the International Federation Working Group, which will work over the remainder of this year to investigate the idea if it's worthwhile to pursue the idea and actually implement and stand up the new organization. So we're at the very early stages of this, certainly in the investigation stage. And this call, that's the main purpose of this call, is to educate you and inform you. And then second, as a follow-up, to ask if your association is interested in having someone represent your association, to nominate that person, and we'll get them onto the working group. So I'll be making a presentation of about 20 slides to go through. Feel free, hopefully everyone can see my slide. If you can't, raise your hand or jump up and down or do something. So feel free to come off mute and ask questions along the way and just interrupt me, or put your comments or questions in Slack, and I'll try to get to them. And then clearly at the end, we've done 2 other calls today. This is our 3rd. We usually have a lot of time at the end and can get into questions and answers, questions and discussion as necessary. So feel free to interrupt, but if you also just kind of want to take notes, we can handle it all at the end too. My associate Joy is on managing the Slack and I'm sorry, not the Slack, but the chat. And if you have any other issues with the webinar, please just put that in chat and she can respond to that. So I'll jump into it. Let me see here. Okay. Let me go back to sharing my screen the way I want to. All right. Oops. Having a hard time with my screen share. Please. Hold on, I'm having a little bit of a hard time with my screen share. 1 second, I'll get this right. Okay. Thank you. Sorry, but I apologize for that. Now we'll go through the presentation. So I began to describe what this is all about. Drupal our mission at the Drupal Association is to support the global Drupal project, to support the communities all around the world. Drupal, I say often, is one of the largest independent open source projects in the world. So we take our stewardship of the global resources very seriously. Resources like Drupal.org, the tools that are on there, the contribution credit system, et cetera, that supports the Drupal global project and the community. And we think now at this time, it's time to at least consider really evolving the way we do that governance. And we think right now the proposal is to evolve that into a governance structure that is a federated system of independent Drupal associations from around the globe that have a formal input into the Drupal association governance. I'll go into a little bit about what that looks like, but I want to talk about why now. And to start that conversation, it was sparked by the Drupal board retreat at DrupalCon Atlanta, but it really has been building for a while, I think, when we're trying to wrestle with a couple of factors in how to build sustainable support for the Drupal project. And if you know, many of you know this actually probably better than me, but if I can go over a short history of the Drupal Association, and Dries did a great overview of this in DrupalCon Pittsburgh in 2023, where he talked about in 2005, I think the first Drupal Association was formed in Belgium. And at the time, what was happening is they were beginning to hold events, and he was using his personal bank account. And he tells the story, he was getting all this money in there, and technically he would have to be taxed on it. So he needed to create an entity to be able to hold, to manage some of the sponsorship and event money. And so really the first purpose or goal of the Drupal Association was a checking account, and pretty much just that. But then shortly thereafter, the Drupal Association took on the role of managing the infrastructure for the project, Drupal.org, the tools, et cetera, beginning to interface with the project on initiatives. And then it changed into, it came over to the US, but it also took on management of the large DrupalCon events that in the US grew to up to 3,000 people at a time, in DrupalCon Europe. And these are large, semi-global events to bring together the Drupal community. And they were big events, and they still are big events to manage. And then the Drupal Association also began taking on efforts and initiatives to support the Drupal community. So creating accounts, the contribution credit system, education, onboarding of new contributors, supporting working groups, and so forth. And then more recently, we've taken on roles in helping the project innovate and helping Drupal market. And we have the board has a push in marketing of Drupal and in helping innovate Drupal. We're certainly engaged with the project on things that we have to do, like project browser, automatic updates, the shift to GitLab, et cetera. So the Drupal Association has to adapt, and it has many different purposes over the years, and has grown in its responsibilities and changed over time. And then along those same lines, we had Drupal associations that popped up at a more local level, regional or country level, to address local issues, address coordination, to support the community at a more local level. And that was happening along the way too. And I think the initiative that we're looking at now is to try to tie all these together, both the local association work that has been going on over the last 15 years, and the work of the Drupal Association, and to build a more connected governance process and support, so that these aren't operating in different spheres, but it's really a connected whole where there's tie-in and there's mutual support for the responsibilities that the current Drupal Association has in maintaining the project. So we're looking at really three drivers about why we're considering a federation at this point. And the first is that the Drupal Association is global, but our governance is not. I think we've done a lot in the last few years to connect with our global responsibilities. More than half of our board is outside the U.S. They're non-U.S. citizens. We have 5 employees that are outside the U.S., and we've been hiring people outside the U.S., again, to be more in tune with the global responsibilities that we have. Having said all that, there is still no formal way for international representation into the Drupal Association's governance. We're still, at the end of the day, a 501c3 nonprofit corporation organized under the laws of the United States. And so I think we looked at what we have to do, what our responsibilities are. And let me share just a couple pieces of data. We have a lot more. But one, we looked at where the contributors to the project come from. And just looking at last year, we had 7,200 plus individual contributors to Drupal. That's a great number. 44% came from Europe. 28% came from North America, so just under a third. But clearly, North America, even in US, is even a smaller percentage of that because Canada is such a strong contributor. But really, 2/3 to 3/4 of contributions come from outside the US or outside of North America. Likewise, we looked at who do we support. So we support right now 138,000 account holders who've had some activity in the last several years. So we think we consider them still active accounts. And those accounts come from all over the world. If you look at this graph, this chart, it's very telling, almost equal between North America, Asia, and Europe. So clearly, our mission and the Drupal Association's support is global and is mostly outside the U.S. Another metric that we are beginning to look at are the number of websites by Connet that are on Drupal that are directly or indirectly supported by, obviously, our maintenance of Drupal.org, security team, etc. So clearly, Drupal is global. The contributions to Drupal account holders are global, but our governance is not. So that's the first reason, to really switch the Drupal Association's governance from a single country to a true global, including global communities. The second, I think, driver is that the internet is becoming more political, and there's a recognition that relying on a single nation's set of laws to solely manage infrastructure that's intended to serve the whole global community poses a risk. Maybe not an imminent risk, but it's more than just an existential risk. I think there is there are, as a kind of a plan B, we need to have an ability, if something were to happen to the Drupal Association in the US, what we do with the servers, what we do with our management of our global responsibilities. So we need to think to that. And we looked at a Belgium law that is specifically designed for international associations. And that is actually, you'll hear this later in this presentation, what we're pursuing. That is the law that we're considering and looking at investigating after some due diligence, because it's specifically designed for international not-for-profits. And to underscore that point is, one of the tenets is this Belgium law, you do not need to have a Belgium member or even anyone in the country of Belgium to form an international not-for-profit under this law. So the United States has the largest number of international not-for-profits, but this law seems to be particularly well suited, and we'll go into the details of why so far we think that is particularly well suited for what we want to do. So the third reason, so first reason is we need global governance. Second is the risk associated with being just in a single nation. But the third reason is that open source needs to be sustainable, distributed, and we need a sustainable distributed stewardship. That it cannot be incumbent on one country to kind of, if you look at it that way, one country to steward these resources for everyone, not just from a governance standpoint, but just from a responsibility standpoint. And so things like the Drupal.org servers, the Drupal trademark, how we make decisions that affect Drupal users, that all should be done through transparent and shared systems. And another stat that I would offer up is we looked at the total revenue that comes in to support the Drupal Association's work in that we do, and 3/4 of it comes from North America, and just under 18% comes from Europe. So the vast majority of the revenue that's used to fulfill our global responsibilities comes from North America. And there's a little bit of history of this. If you go back to the history of the Drupal Association, when DrupalCon North America became very popular in like 2008, 2009, and just attendance took off. And from 2010 to 2019, there were 3,000 people at every DrupalCon, plus or minus 200 people. It's very consistent. And it bluntly, it threw off so much excess revenue that everything else that we did could be funded solely from running that event. What happened with COVID was obviously the in-person DrupalCons went away, and as a source of funding for the DA, that went away for a few years. The DrupalCons, both Europe and US, are now back, but they're not the money makers that they were, and certainly not North America. And plus, when I came on board 2 years ago, one of the mandates was that long-term sustainability of any not-for-profit is tenuous if it is dependent on an event for generating that, because events come and go, the popularity, the costs, and so forth can wax and wane, and that's not a good way to build long-term sustainable funding. So we're looking for, how do we spread that responsibility globally too, in a way that's much more transparent but also fair. One of the ways we looked at doing this, and this is still a priority of ours, is through the Drupal Certified Partner Program. And this is where companies that have made a commitment to supporting Drupal, both in code contributions, but also in helping us financially to support the servers, Drupal.org, all the work that we do, all the things, the trainings, the onboarding and contribution credit system, the community working group, the code of conduct, the DrupalCons, all that we do. We want to identify companies that are made that commitment, and we want to support them. And our mission is going to be to those are the makers, and we're going to drive as much business to those makers as we can, so that the folks using Drupal are supporting companies that are also contributing back at a minimum level to keep the project going. Even looking at that, more than half of our revenue comes from North America. It's a large market. And so it makes sense that when the rest of the world is not included in the US Drupal Association's governance in a formal way, their interest in supporting it may feel like one step removed or they may feel 1 or 2 steps removed from the need to support the project or the interest in supporting the project. And it even comes down to simple things like tax law, where if you contribute to the Drupal Association and you're a US corporation, you can take that off your taxes. If you contribute to the US corporation and you're not a US, you can't take that off your taxes. So it's even a disadvantage in that way. There's even disincentive for non-US parties to support Drupal, from a tax law perspective. So that is another dynamic of this. And this is where we're at, where we're not hitting sustainable revenue to keep the project going, to fulfill all the goals that the board and the community has asked the Drupal Association, in conjunction with the project, to do. So that's the other aspect of this. We need a truly sustainable, transparent, global governance that takes on the responsibility of identifying the priorities, but then also how do we fulfill and fund those priorities. So we're going to shift now a little bit, and trust me, we're already halfway through the presentation. So if you're getting bored, stick with me. We're going to shift. That's a little bit of the history of why we got here. Now I want a little bit of education. Some of you might know this, so I apologize if it takes you back to civics lessons in high school or college. But we're going to talk about what we're talking about in some detail, and then we'll get to questions and answers. And feel free to put comments in the chat as we go through this, so you don't forget what your comments or questions are. So what is a federation? So a federation is basically a group of legally independent organizations that are tied together under a shared governance model. The idea that we're pursuing is that this group would agree on the strategy, they would make the big decisions, they would set the direction, pull resources, But they remain independent members of this international not-for-profit association. So unlike today, the U.S. Drupal Association, we're not a member-based organization. We have members, but we're not organized legally as a member-based organization. A federation, by definition, would be legally, you have to have a certain number of members. They are the voting members of this not-for-profit, and they guide the strategy of it. So it really becomes a global alliance of what we're thinking now of national Drupal associations with like a central, with this international federation not-for-profit acting as kind of a coordinating hub and its own legal distinct entity, but it is the embodiment of its members' wishes, if you will, in terms of strategy and so forth. So that's what a federation is. We looked at where, and we'll jump into some questions in a bit, but we looked at where should we incorporate. So we're already incorporated in the US. We could convert to a member-based international not-for-profit in the US. We looked at UK laws. We looked at Switzerland, Netherlands, and Belgium. And to cut to the chase, after looking at that, talking to different attorneys in Europe specifically, one in the US, we discovered this law in Belgium called the AISBL law, the International Sans But Lucratif. My high school French, I'm not sure if that's French. If that served me well, but I just call it the AISBL. And it is a Belgian law specifically designed for international not-for-profit associations. So that's the I in AISBL. They have an ASBL law that's the same, but just for Belgium only, not-for-profits. So it was specifically designed in 2002, rolled out in 2002 for international associations. One, it provides great flexibility in structuring the not-for-profit. There are a few basic requirements that we have to have, but those are few. And it gives the organizing not-for-profit, the organizing members, the ability to craft the statutes of the incorporating not-for-profit in a very flexible way. So for instance, one of the tenets is that to be a member of the association, you need to be a legal entity. So you need to be legally incorporated somewhere. But we know in the Drupal community, there's a lot of event organizers, groups that are not legally incorporated, but they're an ongoing group. They do, they're active and they want to be involved. We have the ability to incorporate these kind of non-legal entities into the governance of this federation through associate membership or other ways that we can just designate. So there's a lot of flexibility to address all the variations that exist in terms of communities and organizations in the Drupal world. It is officially recognized in Belgium by royal decree, which means that it is officially conferred, and that gives it a higher standing, especially with international funding and kind of an international the respect, as a legitimate international organization. And then Belgium is located in the European Union. Side note, UK and Switzerland are not. So I think it was a little bit of a nudge that organizing our law within the union is probably slightly better than organizing our law that's not. So this is where we're headed, and we've done a fair amount of research to get to this point. This is not definitely set in stone yet, but this is a specific law and direction that we will be investigating to see if this really does work. And then what might this new federation do? So in a nutshell, much of what this new federation would do is what the current US Drupal Association does today. So it would be stewarding shared assets like Drupal.org, our branding, funding platforms and programs that are intended to be global. We would be supporting international collaboration, across events and events that we would do. It would obviously provide a neutral legal home for our Drupal governance. As a organization that serves a digital public good, a global digital public good. This kind of specifically international law designed for companies that don't even have a presence in Belgium or don't have to have a presence in Belgium really sets a neutral tone for its administration. And then, we could ask this, we don't do this, the current U.S. Drupal Association doesn't really do this, but we could act as fiscal host for grants, funding opportunities, and so forth. The international body could act as that at fiscal host. So it's a lot of what the Drupal Association does today could be moved, not all. And then there could be new things that the members say, hey, we want this federation, in addition to supporting Drupal.org and doing these things, we want these other things for these other services or initiatives for the federation to run. And that's a key point. So, I think, and we'll get to this in a little bit, we'll touch on it later, and I'm sure it'll come up in Q&A, but so if this happened and those responsibilities were transferred from the U.S. Drupal Association to this International Drupal Federation, obviously the work of the U.S. Drupal Association would change, and probably change significantly. And I think change for positively. I think the focus of the U.S. Drupal Association would then really, or North America, would really turn to focus on how do we better support the Drupal communities in the U.S. And it would change that focus in that way, because a lot of the global responsibilities would be transferred up to this global federation. So kind of graphically, this is what it would look like, just to be clear what we're talking about. This is all, none of these organizations have committed to this at all. I just pulled them and used them for a graphical representation. So the International Drupal Federation would sit on the top. In this scenario, it would have 4 members: the Dutch Drupal Association, the French Drupal Association, the current US Drupal Association, and the Drupal India Association. So those are all legal entities. And they would be voting members of the International Drupal Federation. So in this sense, in this scenario at least, the current U.S. Drupal Association is one member among other equals to the International Federation. And that kind of hopefully helps kind of paint a picture of how this would change things. So a lot of the current duties that the U.S. Drupal Association does now for stewarding global resources managed or used by the whole world would move up to the International Drupal Federation. And then, as I said, the character and the focus of the U.S. Drupal Association would probably change. So this is just to kind of paint a picture so you can kind of get in your head about what this would look like. So this conversation is just beginning. And what we've done is we've formed an International Federal Working Group. The board, the DA board has, and it has 4 members of the board on it. We've talked to legal experts, both in the U.S. and in Europe, and have settled on the direction of the AISBL for investigation. And we've created a working group, and now with the kickoff of this call and a few other presentations, are inviting representatives from associations around the globe who are interested who could see themselves potentially being interested in being a member of this new association, to participate in a working group to help us investigate, how this would work and if it would work and if it's the right direction to go. And I would say that we're looking for representatives from legal entities. So if you are leadership in a legally incorporated Drupal association, we'd love to have a representative there. But even if you're not a legal entity and you're just an initiative or an event, but you want to participate and you would be willing to consider in the future becoming a legal entity to become a voting member, we would want you to be involved too. So there's no commitment to getting involved. You haven't signed up for anything. You're just part of a working group that's investigating the idea and helping ensure that we get a lot of different viewpoints on how this thing should be put together. So we need folks to join the conversation. The specific type of person that we're looking for would be someone that could negotiate on behalf of your association or group, so that that you would be able to kind of represent their voice. And if you said yes to something, it would be yes on behalf of the group. If you said no, it would be no on behalf of the group. We are probably meeting every 2 weeks, starting in the next 2 weeks, to next week and the week beyond, roughly every 2 weeks through at least through October 2025 and maybe through the end of the year. But we recognize that this is an initiative where we're trying to get associations around the globe involved. So there will be plenty of opportunity for folks to provide comments and work asynchronously on your own, representing your association, giving input, helping make decisions, etc. So do not feel that you need to be locked into in-person meetings every 2 weeks if it's in a super inconvenient if the meeting is not at a time that's convenient for you. And then the last attribute is I would ask for someone that really has a desire to solve Drupal sustainability issues with practical solutions. The federation idea is a big change. If this comes about, it would represent a pretty big evolution in how the Drupal project is governed and managed. And so that's a big change, and that's a big if right now. But what I like about the federated model is it's very practical. Despite that it's a huge change and there's a lot of questions and unknowns, if you put the pieces together, it's a very practical thing. You have members, they set the direction, the association that represents those members are there to implement it. And it's a very kind of concrete and practical solution. It doesn't rely on a lot of complex ideas or mechanisms. So that's part, I think, is a very practical. So we want people that really want to solve the issue and are really comfortable in engaging in just practical boots on the ground type of issues. All right, so let me go in a little bit of education about what the AISBL is, because I think it will help you understand a little bit more about the work that's ahead. So if you want to be a international not-for-profit incorporated under Belgium's AISBL law, there's really just 5 things that you need to have in your statutes. You put in the statutes. In the US, we call those bylaws. It's the same thing. You need to have the name of the organization. You need to have a purpose and activities, and that purpose has to be international. Both checkbox for Drupal, that's fine. The key is the next 3, and really the next 2. Membership. So we need to decide membership categories. So one category is known, that's to be a voting member, an official voting member of the association. What does it take? What are the requirements? And what's the process for becoming one? But as I said, that's what they mandate, but we're flexible to build into this governance associate members, advisory boards, coordinating committees that have formal pieces in this not-for-profits governance, notwithstanding they don't have to be necessarily, unless we want them to be, unless the members that create this want it to be. They don't have to be incorporated entities. They don't have to, be only potentially only one per country or something like that. So we have this ability to be very flexible in that. 2, and probably equally as important, is the membership rights and responsibilities. What are their rights in this federation, and what are their obligations or responsibilities? And likewise, the statutes have to enumerate, and this is back up in the purpose and activities a little bit, what is the rights and responsibilities of the the Drupal International Federation? And what is and this is where, you might look at this as like, what's the business model here? Not just governance, but what's the business model? How does money flow? How does support work? What's going to be supported and when and how? And who has to do what? And this is really where it comes down, in my opinion, where it comes down to this. Ultimately, this has to work for local associations, and it has to work for the DA board. Like the DA board has to say, yes, this is going to improve global governance. But likewise, it has to work for the associations that want to become members. They have to say, yes, I think we're going to have a better, we're going to get better support to be able to operate and do our mission better with having this international federation, being a member of this international federation. And then we need admission. What does it take to become a member? What does it take to leave membership, et cetera? And then the governance structure is really 2 bodies that are required under this: the General Assembly and a Board of Directors. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then lastly, financial provisions. So what's the financial year? There are audit requirements under this law. They're spelled out. They're not complex. They're, in my initial investigation, they're no more complex than what the DA does now under U.S. law when we get a full audit every year on our finances. But those are required to be submitted, and there's an annual report and a few other reporting that's required to be submitted to the Belgian government to maintain this. So not a lot, some few concrete things, but not a lot of detail, not a lot of requirements. So we have a lot of flexibility. Under the governance structure, there are two bodies that are required under the AISBL law. The first is the General Assembly. And this General Assembly must meet once a year. Doesn't have to meet in person, can also meet virtually. And at that meeting, they approve they approve last year's audit, next year's budget. And presumably at the time they approve the board of directors, which is the second body that's required. But that's really it. The General Assembly can meet more often, but it doesn't have to. And as I said before, it doesn't even require to have a member in Belgium in order to organize under this law. So the way I look at the General Assembly is it's kind of like the annual meeting once a year. Typically, in many of these organizations, it's the annual meeting or meetings where the members and voting members set the direction, set the strategy for the coming year, approve the budget. Budget's a policy document ultimately, and then is not actively involved in decision making. What they do is they confer to the board of directors, which they also designate who the board of directors are of the International Federation, and the board of directors, like the DA board today, are the people that actually run the organization or oversee the organization from month to month or week to week as needed. So like the current DA board meets 4 to 6 times a year virtually. We meet twice a year in person at a retreat. We approve the budget and all that. And I talk regularly with my chair. I'm talking regularly with almost all the board members. And then so those are the two things that there has to be. The members have to gather once a year in a general assembly. And then there has to be a board of directors that kind of manages the association. So don't think that if you participate or if you became a member that your association is somehow day to day, week to week, even month to month, necessarily involved in the governance of this international federation. It could be once a year, and then you might have a board member. If you had a board member on there, that they might be a little bit more involved. But it likely wouldn't be, and doesn't have to be one board member for one member. That would probably get too cumbersome. So, but those are required. Beyond that, we can add what else we want, and we can add more definition and processes to both of these bodies, depending on what the members want. So there's a lot of topics to be discussed, but just to kind of signal and talk about a few of them, and without going into detail, but these are a sampling of the topics that the working group is going to need to wrestle with. How are DrupalCons administered? Right now, we administer from the Drupal Association in the U.S. We do it ourselves in North America under contract in Europe, and we partner with a community group, Drupal South in Asia. How are local events supported? So, how can the International Drupal Federation support local events better? What are the needs? What is that? What are the roles and responsibilities in doing that? How does financial sponsorship of the project work? So we still have to run Drupal.org, the credit contribution system, interface with the project. Like how is that done and how is that funded? How can the Drupal Certified Partner Program be administered through local associations? That's a question. Right now, we administer from the U.S. But as I said, for tax reasons and others, if we did a federation, it would make a lot more sense to have it administered through the local associations for tax purposes and others. How can event sponsorship be coordinated? So, the current Drupal Association is seeking sponsors for DrupalCons and digital sponsorships, et cetera, for the website and so forth. Local associations are often always looking for sponsors for events. How do we better coordinate that? And more than just coordination, how can there actually be a single process by which all parties get what they need and sponsors are seeing kind of a coordinated and seamless process for their involvement in the Drupal ecosystem? And then last question, there's many more questions. This is not an exhaustive list, but how are trademarks managed? Currently, the Drupal Association in the U.S. has a license in perpetuity from Dries for the DrupalCon name and for DrupalCon and for Drupal itself. presumably that would be transferred to the International Federation. And then there would be rules that may be very similar to what we have today, but probably would have to be tweaked a little bit about when that International Federation can confer the trademarks or to other organizations and events. So just some of the issues that we need to tackle. So what we're talking about in the next few months, this is, I believe, my last slide. So we are looking, if we can follow this time frame, it's an aggressive time frame, but it moves us along pretty quickly. So the first phase with 3 phases. First phase starts next week in June. And phase 1 is really to develop the principles and the framework, look at the big questions, and develop the principles and the framework that would be the operating principles of the federation, kind of like a high level. What would it look like? What would be a framework? What would be the agreements? And the purpose of that is twofold. First is, can we put together a framework that addresses the problems in a way that the Drupal associations that would be members are comfortable? And if we do, and we could end this process in 2 months, and we have 4 or 5 or whatever number of associations saying, yes, this is good with us, we would participate on this. And the second question is, does it solve the problems that the Drupal Association board that started this project, does it solve their problems in a way that they're comfortable with? And if they say yes at the board vote, then we'd move into phase 2. And phase 2 is taking those principles, that framework, which is the high level discussions and agreements and so forth, and then putting them into an actual application. So we would work with council. We would put together a formal application for submission to the Belgian government under the AISBL law. And then at DrupalCon Vienna, the goal would be by then we would have sign off by the local associations that are hopefully at that point still interested in pursuing this and actually officially being part of the application, saying that if approved, we will be members of this organization and we will take on these rights and responsibilities. And the DA board, same thing. They'll look at it during their retreat. They'll vote on it at the board meeting, DrupalCon Vienna, if they're at there. And then we're going to third phase. The third phase would be actually submitting, we'd hit the button, submit the application to the Belgian government. That takes anywhere from 1 to 2 months, sometimes 3. Although I think if we did all this legwork, it wouldn't take that long. But then there would still be work to do where there may be things that are not in the statute that have to be formally approved, but we might need memorandums of understanding or other agreements as a transition point. So for instance, if we follow this timeline, the new association could stand up as early as first quarter of next year. It's unlikely that the US Drupal Association would be in a position to move over all of our assets and people and all that as quickly. So there may need to be, like in the short run, an MOU where the current US Drupal Association, under contract, provides services to this international federation for Drupal.org and for different things. And then along a more reasonable path, we're transferring things over to the new association and beginning to revision what the U.S. Drupal Association would be focused on. So ambitious time frame, but that's what. But this is what we're looking at. If we don't hit these, that's fine. If it's on the right track but slower, we can work with that. But we wanted to set it kind of an ambitious time frame to be able to investigate, make a decision, and then if it's a good decision, let's move on it quickly. We do think there'll be a lot of opportunities in funding open source support in Europe, and it would be good to be positioned for that. That's one reason. But the second is it would allow us to move quickly on other issues that we're struggling with, the sustainability issues that we have with the project. We've been trying different things and certain things not working. If we think this will improve our ability to create a much more sustainable ecosystem, then let's not wait. Let's move on it. So that's kind of we're going to pause there. That's the end of my formal presentation. Congratulations, you made it through. But I would end with the overall goal of this is, and the Drupal community is great about this, but it is about a pretty significant evolution of governance from a single nation-based approach that we employ today to a truly federated global system that's open and collaborative and shared. So let me pause there. I know there's been a lot of comments. I saw them racked up. I'll go from the top, but I would also invite people to, if you just want to come off mute and ask a question, feel free to do that. Oh yeah, the European, yep, Emery, thank you for the note on the European Commission. Let's see, there is the example. Okay, let me answer Julia's question. Would the Federation be able to provide a global insurance cover for events to an association, such as public liability for conferences in a specific country? Good question. I can't answer yes right now. But that could be one of the services that would be written into the roles and responsibilities of the international association. So that's like being a fiscal host. I don't see why there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, we also want you to be able to provide insurance. Now I have to look into exactly what it takes to provide insurance. I'm not an expert in that field, but that could be one of the responsibilities that the members ask of the International Federation. Would there be an annual membership fee? If yes, do we have an idea of what that might be? We don't. There's not by definition an international membership fee. The associations would be responsible for determining how is this international federation not-for-profit going to be funded? Where is it going to get its money from? How is it going to spend that money to fulfill its duties? So given that, so there's not an automatic membership fee. There could be if the members got together and said, hey, we want every association to pay this much upfront or annually, that could be possible, but it's not mandated in any way. Presumably, much of the funding, I showed the graph, much of the funding that the Drupal Association receives today that is used to support the Drupal project, Drupal.org, the servers, automatic updates, GitLab, project browser, contrib system, education materials, all that. A lot of that funding would be, I think, that funding flow would be transferred to the International Federation. And then this is just me thinking out loud. The Drupal, the working group would have to figure this out. But then the Drupal Association, as I said, in one sense, would change its mission and its focus, probably much more on how does it better support the U.S. Drupal communities and how does it, activate at that level. And then it would find different way, and it would be a member of the association. So in the same way that Drupal associations across the globe today fund themselves, the U.S. Drupal Association would fund itself in the same manner and have the same responsibilities. So that's one thing to think about is that, again, I was going to predict all the funding that's coming to the U.S. Drupal Association would be going to this international federation. And so that may preclude the need for an annual membership fee, potentially, but that's something the members would have to kind of figure out. April writes, would most of the current activities of the U.S. covered by the new federation? Hey, you just kind of said that. That's great. Yes. So I would say there's some things to be open, some things for discussion. So, but yeah, most of the duties, like certainly infrastructure, tools, contrib system, that sort of thing. Now, I could see a world where DrupalCon North America stayed in Drupal, in the Drupal US, something like that. That would have to be decided. But I would argue probably most of the activities. In fact, I think it's one thing that the U.S. Drupal Association has neglected maybe a little bit, would be the focus on supporting the U.S. Drupal communities because we've been so focused on these global responsibilities. And then would the USDA be able to take on things they haven't in the past, like camp fiscal hosting? Yeah, so I think very clearly that would be freed up from global responsibilities. The U.S. Drupal Association could then take on other responsibilities. They would have to find the model for funding that and sustaining that. But that would be, presumably, the one of the big changes for the Drupal Association. Let me pause in the chat questions. And Aaron, if you want to ask your question.
Thanks. Yeah. Aaron McHale here, I guess representing Drupal Scotland. We organize Drupal Camp Scotland, which happens in Edinburgh November, and I see an opportunity here with this to really connect the local camps and also provide them a lot more support. And so I wonder if there's any ideas so far, or if this is still to be figured out, what a sort of support model could potentially look like for local camps. I think one example that comes to mind, I've recently been at Drupal Dev Days, but also Drupal Camp England, and while I was there, I informally got a slide in promoting Drupal Camp Scotland, but again, that was just because of that informal relationship. Whereas I wonder if there's opportunities then to coordinate these kind of cross-camp promotions, but then other things around assets and branding and all that stuff. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that at the moment.
No conclusions, but lots of there have been some discussions on that, and I would say of the associations I've talked to date that are interested in this, they want to engage in those conversations. That's where they want to see, like, this is what they could get out of it, would be this kind of support. And the support model could be, as I said, fiscal host. It could be shared systems. So a registration system that is paid for by the International Federation, and local camps can use to set up their own camps and register people, if that makes sense. Website hosting. So local camps run their own website, but the International Federation can host it and take all the kind of the infrastructure expenses and requirements, because they can do it across multiple associations. Would be some of the things I've heard that could be done at the international level. But that would certainly be a topic of conversation among the working group about what is needed. And this is kind of the business model. What's needed by the local association and camps? What can the Drupal International Federation provide? And how does support flow between the two to make that happen? Good
Thank
question.
you.
Yep. Thank you. And let me keep going. If there's questions, please raise your hand or just speak up. Rotary International has a publicly available template which can assist with the elements needed for the ASPL statutes. That could be used for starting. Great, thank you, Julia, for that tip. I didn't think about that. That's a great tip. Let me ask a question from Pedro. How does a federation impact the DA board? Will it replace it? How will these federated seats be involved in the decision making? So yeah, so the DA board would stay the board of the Drupal Association US. The DA board in the US would not automatically, by definition, become the board of the International Federation. The members that create this federation would decide on what the board structure looks like, how many, what's the, not who necessarily initially, but what's the structure of the board, how many, what are the rights, and so forth. Now, presumably, Dries has a seat on the DA board. Probably makes sense to have Dries have a seat on the International Federation. So there will be some connection there, but the members would have to decide what the board looks like, and the U.S. board would not automatically become the International Federation board. And in fact, probably the U.S. Drupal Association would have to re-look at its board and say, do we have the right size board? Is it is it the right? Probably need fewer international people on the U.S. board because the focus would change. That sort of thing would happen. And so there's two pieces of that. One is, where do we want to be, and then how do we get there? And then the seats would presumably, yes, the associations that became members of the federation would have a voting right to determine the board of the International Federation. It doesn't necessarily have to be every member has one seat on the board. And that might get, if we had 20 or 30 members, that could get very cumbersome. But there is this General Assembly once a year, and the members would approve the budget or not approve the budget, would approve the audit from the past, and approve changes to the statutes if there were some. So once a year, the members have a very direct voice in the direction of the federation. And then they rely on this board, which they would have input on and collectively decide on, maybe not one-to-one seats, but that would then take on the role of fulfilling that direction that the General Assembly decided upon once a year. More Pedro questions. Tax relief of is really important. Yep, I think that's one of the advantages of if we can pull this off, that would incur from this model. Does this suppose a risk of funding this international entity at the cost of the local associations? International companies will fund one entity. Is the international association going to be a taker or a maker? Well, I hope we're a maker. I hope the International Federation, whatever it is a maker. I would argue for this to work, this is a pretty profound change. If the Spanish Drupal Association became a member of the International Drupal Federation, you would have, yes, you have the responsibility to make sure that International Federation is funded, and you as a member among the other members would have that responsibility. But you can also decide on the flow of funds and on how these programs work, so that so there's not a competitive issue between a local association and the international association in terms of sponsorship or other types of funding mechanisms. But there's truly a coordinated, like that international association federation would serve the members' needs. It has its own responsibilities that the members need to make sure that they can fulfill, but it would also be there to serve the members' needs. So I think just by definition, the members drive the organization. So there's a much better chance of real collaboration and coordination and agreement on how things should go. Thank you, Emma, for the comment on Drupal Jam and Drupal Dev Days. I'm just looking for. Thank you, Carlos, on your comment. This could be a real game changer. I will say this is we're just investigating right now, but this would be a pretty dramatic change. And it has to be agreed to by, legally you have to have at least 2 associations. They say 3, so you have a tiebreaker if there's a vote. But realistically, we would need to determine what number of associations makes sense for this to go forward. It's probably more than 3. Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 12? How many Drupal associations do we need involved in this to make this go forward, to make it worthwhile? But it would be a pretty big change if it comes about. Question from yours: I think you need to balance between DCPs and local communities giving more space and voice in the federation to companies without reducing the importance and participation of local communities. Yeah, I think that's right. I think, as I said, as I alluded, what we're doing now at the Drupal Association is supporting the DCP program and trying to get companies all over the globe to make that commitment to being a DCP and to being a maker. We would still have to do that, but it wouldn't be done from a U.S. not-for-profit stance. It would be done from this international federation, and your association presumably would be a member of it. So I think that, again, there's more opportunity for figuring out a better way to ensure that the resources are there to support Drupal.org and the other goals, and to do it in coordination with local camps and associations. Is the Drupal Federation in the Drupal Federation breakdown? I didn't see a representation of Africa. I only saw France. And where is Africa located? So yeah, that was just an example, and none of those organizations have committed to joining it. I just wanted to people could kind of understand visually how this would look. We know the work you've been doing in Burkina Faso, and we support it. And like I said, what I didn't put in that model is where associate members could be involved. And so non-legal entities could become associate members. There could be advisory committees. So I think Africa could be involved in a number of different ways, formally into the governance of the Drupal Association, of this International Drupal Association. So that's all to be determined. And I would encourage you to nominate someone to participate in this process to see how you get involved. What everyone will receive after this call is you'll receive a copy of this PowerPoint, and you will receive a survey. And the survey will ask a few questions. The main question is, does your association want to nominate someone to participate in this process? And if so, identify who that person is and let me know, and we'll add them to the working group. And I've already talked about the type of person we're looking for and what their commitment would be. So in that, I would encourage you, if you know, again, it's not a commitment to join, it's just a commitment to be part of the investigation process. And if you're, you know, we would want, if at the end of the process it works for you, then we would ask for, okay, we think this works for you, will you make a commitment? But the first phase is just exploring. This started, okay, this started, Imra, thank you, Imra, for your comment. That's good, thank you. Yep, there's a lot, yes, so thank you, Karen, for your comment. If anyone wants to expand on their comments, feel free to come off mute. Mike, are there other open source projects that operate under this model that we can learn from? So I know the Eclipse Foundation, which the Drupal Association just joined, which is a European foundation, just transitioned from their, however they were organized, to this law. And someone who's on their board is on our board. Sachiko Muto, I'm not sure if she's on their board, but she's familiar with that arrangement. She's the one who's actually, she's one of our board members. She put me in touch with a Belgian law firm that can handle this process. And I know the Eclipse Foundation, and I think there's a couple others that have moved under this new law. So we do have some resources that we've already talked to and some that we can talk to assist in this process. I'm not sure about open source projects like Drupal, though. I'm just not familiar with it. And my quick research of companies organized under this law, I didn't see any open source projects. Doesn't mean they're not there. I just didn't find them. But that's a good idea. Julia asked, does this mean we could be looking at brand consistency on naming conventions, e.e. Drupal Association Australia? Potentially, yeah. I mean, that would be a potential if the members. So there's two aspects to this. If the members thought it was the right thing to do, then to be a member of the International Federation, they could say, hey, you must agree to these brand standards, and that might be good. Obviously, one of the issues we're trying to address in marketing is having a consistent brand across the globe that have, sufficient input for local conditions, but kind of have a consistent, broad brand. I will say that one caveat to this is the trademarks. So Dries owns the trademarks. He grants them to the U.S. Drupal Association right now for our work, and so the trademarks would always, right now, are always going to be ultimately under the control of Dries, unless that changes. So there would be a little bit of, it's not just up to the International Federation. Anything that's non-trademarky, if you will, would be up to the International Federation, but trademarks would still be reserved under Dries, and whatever agreement he made would be the International Federation. Australia, really good comments, and I like the Rotary International. We'll look into that, and then Avi. Right now, there's no formal model for Drupal local associations. Seems like that would be important, as there are lots of places without formal local associations. Yeah, that's right. So we have the flexibility. So there's two things. Avi, I know you're in the United States here. So we have there's two issues here. One is the flexibility that this law provides does provide the members the opportunity to incorporate non-legal entities formally into the governance process through associate members, etc. So it does afford that. So there's a way to do that. Second, there's a unique issue in the U.S. that we need to explore, which the model that we've been thinking about so far is that there's one association would be a member of this international association per country. That's just what we've been thinking. It's not a decision, just the way we've been thinking about it. Well, in the U.S., that means just the U.S. Drupal Association would be the member. But the U.S. has a lot of communities that have Drupal associations, Drupal event organizers, Drupal for Gov, a lot of groups. How do we manage that? And they don't have a formal, they're not connected to the U.S. Drupal Association's governance in any formal way. And so what do we do with that? How do we manage it? Is that the right thing? And the other side of the issue is if the U.S. has one member in this international federation, and European countries have 10, it may be, and both markets are pretty similar in size. It may be considered unfair that for U.S. has one vote if it's one vote for association, and Europe has 10. And we might just replicate the issues the issues we have today if we have a very U.S. focused not-for-profit in the U.S. Drupal Association, and we transfer this international federation, and it's just dominated by Europe. That we could be just transferring the problem, not solving the problem. So those are two kind of interesting issues that we have to think about how to solve if we go down this route that has to do with the U.S. And given the fact that we have so many local associations that could potentially have a role in this international association, or maybe should. That may be more than your question, but I just decided to answer it. And then I'm glad Imra's on the call. Imra's a wealth of knowledge about this. Okay, so Carlos says, we are in a chicken and egg situation in many areas: community, code, sustainability, company's bottom line. These changes are needed to start by creating a way where we can actually involve the global Drupal community. This can only result in moving forward in all areas. That's right. I think this is a big change, and what I was saying about the practical solution would be a big change, but it's a very concrete solution that if it worked for folks, and it would have to work for your association, you would have to take a measured look at it, say, yes, we will be better off under this new federation than we are today. And the Drupal Association board has to say, in managing the global resources, we would be, Drupal would be better off, under this federation than we are today. And if both those things happen, then the change works. So I would just encourage us to kind of stay on the very practical. We can't be pie in the sky and kind of wishing good things and be, but if we stay practical and can make that evaluation, and both parties can make that evaluation, then I think it will be successful. And that, with Carlos's last comment, concludes the questions in chat. I would give folks, if there's other questions, please come off mute, raise your hand, or just speak up. Let me talk about next steps. You'll receive an email after this, as I said, with a copy of this presentation. Please share it with your association leadership. You will receive a survey also that will ask a few questions, but the most important question is, do you want to participate on the working group? And if you do, nominate who is your representative that's kind of empowered to negotiate on behalf of your association. And we will work through phase 1, and that's going to be from June to July. So that's kind of the very concrete next steps. We do have a project page set up for this. We do not have a Slack channel set up for the whole community yet. The working group has a Slack channel, and we'll be using Slack primarily as its means of communication. We will use the project page initially to keep the community up to date on the progress of the working group. And then we may flip that to Slack. So I'll have to talk to Joy and others to figure out what's the best in the working group, what's the best way to communicate stuff out. But the working group will begin meeting next week. I mean, there's already a scheduled meeting. Doesn't mean that you have to have a decision by next week. If you do, great. But if you have a decision next week, we can feather your representative in the following week and in the following meeting. So don't feel you have to rush this. But in the next week or so, if we could get a nomination from you, that would be great. So those are follow-ups. Thank you for.
Yeah. Tim, if I can add, like being part of the working group, we're adding 2 members from the European community starting next week. There was a question from Avi a few messages back about the Drupal Federation Slack channel. It's good that we have that page. It's good that we do the follow-up, but it's also good to, we're looking into, the question came up looking into a place for people to like, hey, I have this question, I have this input, where do I go to? So this port of call for people, for folks, for all of you to go to, like, oh, I have this question, I want to participate, where do I go with these comments or this input? It's very important that we have this place very soonish.
Yeah, thank you, Imra. So Imra is the chair of the board working group. He's one of my favorite board members, one of 12 of my favorite board members, and he's leading this initiative on behalf of the board. So thank you. And so we'll find ways to, what's the best way to communicate? We'll figure that out and get that out, and we'll always take feedback on, hey, can we be doing this or could we be doing that? All right. So let me answer Arena's last question. Is this relevant for events organizers groups? That's a good question. Possibly. And I would suggest putting your questions in the survey that you'll get and comments, and let us consider that. I see if you do more than just one event a year and you're kind of the group that represents the Drupal community in that area, maybe do monthly, I would say, I think it would be, this could affect you, because if you're looking for support, and how do you become part of this, more of a federation network on an ongoing basis, and you need support from either the Drupal Association US or this international, then those are the questions to ask yourself whether you should join or not. I know a lot of local communities basically are event organizers. That's all they do. So, and they should be part of this. So my bias would be to say yes, that event organizers, if there's an ongoing group, should consider joining this, either directly in the working group or staying close to what's being discussed and being ready to engage as needed. Right. So thank you for your participation this afternoon. We're coming up just to the end of the call. Look for that email. Please respond to the survey. Go to the project page, and we will be communicating out progress and keeping folks up to date. So if you have questions, feel free to email me or Slack me offline. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing your representative participate on the International Federation Working Group. Thank you, and have a good afternoon for those in the US, good evening for those in Europe, and good morning for those farther west. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Bye now.